In the early 1970s, roughly 2 million used tires were dumped into the Atlantic off Fort Lauderdale, Florida, in a project called Osborne Reef, once billed as the world's largest artificial reef, to create a new home for marine life. It wasn't some fringe experiment either. It had government approval and backing from one of the biggest tire companies in the country, which raises the obvious question: how did sinking tires seem like a genuinely good idea to begin with? One worth all of that support? Everyone involved was so sure it would work that nobody stopped to ask what could go wrong. But 50 years later, nobody expected what happened next. If you want to know exactly what happened, subscribe before we get into it. The tire crisis that made this seem necessary. To understand why anyone thought sinking 2 million tires into the ocean was a smart idea, you first have to understand what America was up against in the early 1970s, because the country was quietly drowning in used tires. Every year, hundreds of millions of them were coming off the roads and being thrown away. And over the years, they built up into massive storage heaps called stockpiles, mountains of black rubber sitting on the outskirts of towns, growing higher every season until the national stockpile ran into the billions. The obvious answer, burying them in a landfill, did not work. Landfills across the country simply refused to take tires because tires refused to behave. Their round, hollow shape trapped air inside, and buried tires would slowly rise back up through the trash and pop out at the surface. And once they were up there, their curved insides collected rainwater and turned into perfect pools for mosquitoes. But the worst-case scenario was much darker. A pile of used tires, once it caught fire, was almost impossible to put out, because that same trapped air fed the flames and rubber burns extremely hot. A tire fire did not go out in hours or days. It could burn for weeks or even months, pouring toxic black smoke into the air. Between 1971 and 1988, the EPA recorded more than 170 major tire fires in the United States, including a legendary 1983 blaze in Winchester, Virginia, that smoldered for nearly 9 months. So this was not a small headache. It was one of the biggest solid waste problems the country faced, and everyone was looking for a way out. Which is exactly why an idea that sounded a little crazy, dropping those tires into the ocean, actually started to sound brilliant. The man behind the plan, and the loophole. And that idea came from a specific man. His name was Ray McAllister, and he was a professor of ocean engineering at Florida Atlantic University, someone who had spent his career thinking about how the sea and human structures interact. With that background, he was perfectly placed to see the tire crisis and start looking for an ocean-based solution. In 1974, he helped found a small local nonprofit, a group organized for a cause rather than to make money, called Broward Artificial Reef Incorporated, or BARINC for short. And through BARINC, he pitched a plan he genuinely believed could solve 2 problems at the same time. The pitch was simple. Take those useless, dangerous mountains of scrap tires, bundle them together with metal clips, and drop them onto the seabed off the coast of Fort Lauderdale, where they would form a giant new artificial reef, a place fish and coral would move into and thrive. In his own words, the really good idea was to provide habitat for marine critters so we could double or triple marine life in the area. But there was a catch, and it was a legal one. In October of 1972, the United States had just passed a major new law called the Marine Protection, Research, and Sanctuaries Act, better known as the Ocean Dumping Act. On paper, it was designed to stop exactly this thing, throwing waste into the sea. Dropping 2 million used tires straight into the Atlantic sounded like a textbook violation of a law that had been on the books for barely a year. Except, the law had a very specific loophole built right into the fine print. Placing materials in the ocean did not legally count as dumping if it was done for the purpose of building up fisheries. In other words, if you were tossing tires in the sea as garbage, that was illegal. But if you were tossing the exact same tires in the sea to build a fish habitat, that was fine. And Ray McAllister and Barinks were, on paper, doing the second thing. The tire reef sat neatly in that gray area between waste disposal and marine infrastructure, and the plan slid straight through. Once that door was open, the official approvals came fast. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers signed off on it, and it stopped being a wild idea and became a legitimate, government-approved project. And then came the corporate seal of approval, which really turned it into a spectacle. The Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, one of the biggest tire manufacturers in the country, came on board, donating scrap tires by the truckload and providing the equipment used to bind and compress them into bundles. And to properly celebrate the launch of the world's biggest tire reef, Goodyear sent its famous blimp overhead, which ceremonially dropped a single gold-painted tire into the water to christen the site. It was a full-on triumph, the kind of moment where it looks like everyone has won. And so, starting in the spring of 1974, the operation began. More than 100 private boats, working alongside a U.S. Navy minesweeper called the USS Thrush, spent weeks shuttling bundles of tires out to the site and dropping them onto the seabed. In the end, roughly 2 million tires were sunk across an area about the size of 15 city blocks in 20 meters of water, just over a mile from the Fort Lauderdale shore. It was one of the biggest artificial reef projects the world had ever seen. And for a while, it actually looked like it was working. Why the first 25 years looked like a success. Why the first 25 years looked like a success. For years after the tires went in, the story looked like it was heading toward a win. Fish started showing up around the tire fields, drawn to the structure the way fish are drawn to almost anything solid on an open seafloor. Divers and researchers checking in on the site could point to real activity. Marine life moving through the tires, some of it sticking around. And by the early to mid-1990s, roughly 2 decades after the first tires went in, about 10% of the tire structures had some form of marine life established on them. On paper, that was the number everyone had been waiting for. 10% doesn't sound like much on its own, but coral colonization is slow by nature. It can take years just to get a foothold on any surface, let alone spread. So even a partial number like that was read, at the time, as early proof that the reef was doing exactly what it was designed to do, just on a longer timeline than anyone had hoped. Nothing about the reporting in those years suggested trouble. The project kept getting cited as an example of turning a waste problem into an environmental win, and Osborne Reef held its reputation as a model, not a warning. But that read on the site was about to change completely, because underneath the surface, the very thing holding those 2 million tires in place had been quietly failing the entire time. Why the ties failed? The tires themselves were never the weak point. What held the whole structure together was the steel clips and nylon straps binding thousands of bundles into place, and none of it was built to survive decades underwater. That might not sound like a fatal flaw. Untreated metal in water rusts. Everybody knows that much. But what nobody accounted for was exactly how fast and exactly why. Steel and saltwater don't mix well under any circumstances, but there's a specific point where it gets worse, a sweet spot for corrosion. Saltwater carries dissolved oxygen, and steel needs that oxygen touching its surface to keep rusting. The more salt in the water, up to a point, the more that reaction speeds up. But push the salinity past a certain level, and something strange happens. The water gets too salty to hold as much oxygen, so the corrosion reaction actually starts running out of fuel and slows back down. In other words, there's a specific salt concentration where rust does its worst damage, not the saltiest water, not the least salty, right in the middle. And that middle point isn't some rare condition. It's roughly the salinity of ordinary ocean water, which means Osborne Reef didn't get unlucky with some uniquely corrosive patch of the Atlantic. It sat in completely normal seawater, and normal seawater was already enough to eat through untreated steel far faster than anyone building the reef had planned for. That's exactly what happened to the clips holding the tire bundles together. They didn't take decades to fail. They started corroding within the first couple of years, and the damage just kept compounding from there. By the time anyone seriously reassessed the site in the 1990s, tens of thousands of bundles had already come apart at the seams. Once those clips gave out, there was nothing left holding 2 million tires in formation. They were just loose now, sitting on the seafloor, free to drift with every current and every storm that passed overhead. The loosening wasn't even the whole problem. Even in the bundles that had briefly held together, the coral never showed up the way anyone hoped. Tire rubber is smooth and slick, nothing like the rough mineral surface coral larvae actually need to attach to. Algae found it easy to grow there instead. Coral, for the most part, never did. So even without the corrosion, the reef was never going to form on its own terms. Subscribe if you want to see exactly how bad this actually got, because it gets worse. The double disaster. There's a difference between a tire sitting in a junkyard and a tire loose on the ocean floor, and it comes down to what the water lets it do. On land, a tire just takes up space. In the ocean, gravity and current turn it into something else, something that moves. It's light enough for a current to drag along, but heavy and dense enough to do real damage on impact, which turns each one into a small, slow-moving, wrecking ball. Osborne Reef had 2 million of them, all set loose at once. The location made this so much worse than it had to be. Osborne sat wedged directly between two natural coral reefs, so once the tires broke free, they didn't have far to travel before they found something living to hit. As they scattered, they crashed straight into the reef nearby, and the damage built up gradually instead of all at once. First, it was a few tires here and there, then thousands, piling against the coral, pressing down on it, cutting off the light and space new coral needed to grow while slowly grinding away at what was already there. The scale of that damage is hard to picture until you put a number on it. Storms and currents scoured a stretch of ocean floor the size of 31 football fields, turning what had been a living coral tract into a dead zone. And the damage never fully reversed, even decades later. Hurricanes are still throwing tires up onto Florida beaches today, a physical reminder that this story never actually closed. But the wreckage on the seafloor was only half of what was happening. Tires don't go inert once they hit the water. They're made from a mix of rubber compounds, resins, and additives, and a growing body of research has found that the mix doesn't just sit there quietly. It breaks down, and once it breaks down, it leaches out. There's a case that makes this easy to picture. In the 1980s, France sank a much smaller tire reef of its own off the Riviera, 25,000 tires between Cannes and Antibes. In 2005, researchers at the University of Nice confirmed what officials hadn't planned for. The tires were leaking chemicals, including heavy metals, into the surrounding water. That finding alone was enough for France to start pulling its reef back out. So the honest picture at Osborne isn't just 2 million wrecking balls scraping across the seafloor. It's that, plus something slower and quieter running underneath it. A chemical leak that's been going on for 50 years without anyone ever confirming its full scale. Which raises an obvious question. If a tire reef this size was always going to end up leaking, why isn't the company that donated the tires the one paying to clean it up? The company that walked away Goodyear wasn't just a name attached to Osborne Reef in passing. The company supplied truckloads of tires and donated the equipment used to bind them into bundles. And when it came time to launch, Goodyear turned the moment into a piece of theater, sending its own blimp overhead to drop a gold-painted tire into the water and christen the sight in front of everyone watching. This wasn't quiet corporate support behind the scenes. It was a company putting its name front and center, celebrating its role in the project for the cameras. That makes what happened next stand out even more sharply. In the 50-plus years since, Goodyear has offered essentially nothing toward the cleanup. No funded restoration program, no meaningful financial commitment. Nothing on record tying the company back to reversing any of the damage its own product went on to cause. Contrast becomes obvious the moment you look at France. When researchers confirmed the Riviera's tire reef was leaking toxins, the French government launched a cleanup costing well over €1 million. And Michelin, the company whose tires were sitting on that seafloor, stepped in and contributed €200,000 of its own money toward the operation without waiting to be forced into it. Same basic situation on both sides of the Atlantic, and two completely different responses from the two tire companies involved. One that helped pay to clean up its own industry's mess, and one that simply didn't. So who has actually been footing the bill at Osborne all these years? It hasn't been Goodyear, it's been the public, in one form or another. U.S. Navy divers spending years down there as part of training missions, state agencies funding one contractor after another, and volunteer groups like 4Ocean chipping away at whatever's left. Taxpayers and donors have carried the cost of a mess that a Fortune 500 company helped create and then simply walked away from. Which brings us to the strangest, slowest cleanup effort in modern ocean history. Why cleanup is nearly impossible. Cleaning up a mess like this isn't like other ocean cleanup jobs. Clearing debris off a beach or pulling silt out of a harbor channel is straightforward work. Machines can do most of it. This is nothing like that. There's no machine that sweeps 2 million tires off a seafloor in one pass. Every single tire has to be found by hand, hooked to a line one at a time, and hauled up individually, over and over again, for as long as the job takes. And the job takes a long time because of who's actually doing it and what they're working with. That work has mostly fallen to Navy divers, running multi-year salvage operations as part of their own training, alongside environmental groups like 4Ocean, who've taken on parts of the job more recently. But it's not cheap and it's not fast. The cost runs into tens of millions of dollars. The diving itself is slow and genuinely dangerous, and the weather decides when it can even happen. Calm water and the right season are the only conditions divers can safely work in, so a lot of the calendar year isn't usable at all. But even with all that effort, the honest scoreboard isn't encouraging. Even with sustained work stretching back to the 2000s, a majority of the original 2 million tires are still sitting on that seafloor today. Every hurricane season adds insult to that number, since a single storm can undo months of work in a matter of hours. Still, it's not a story of pure loss. There has been one genuine bright spot in all of this. During related coral rescue efforts tied to the cleanup, teams have carefully removed coral fragments growing on the tires and transplanted them onto healthier reefs nearby, hundreds of them, with survival rates close to 90% in the first year. It's a small, painstaking proof that some of what this project destroyed can still be saved, even if it has to happen one fragment at a time. Which leaves one more question worth asking before this story wraps up. Was the mistake building an artificial reef in the first place? Or was it specifically choosing tires as the material to build one with? The lesson buried under the tires. Look at everything that went into this, and the strange part is how hard it is to find a villain. This wasn't a company sneaking waste into the ocean under cover of night. It was the opposite of that, a project backed by the federal government, supervised by the Navy, celebrated by a major American company, and driven by a man who genuinely believed he was solving two problems at once. Ray McAllister said it best himself, decades later, looking back at the project he helped build. The really good idea was to provide habitat for marine critters so we could double or triple marine life in the area, he said. It just didn't work that way. And then, more simply, I look back now and see it was a bad idea. That's the uncomfortable part of this story. Every piece of the plan was reasonable and popular at the time it was made. Nobody involved was cutting corners on purpose. And yet it failed anyway, for reasons nobody had bothered to actually test first. Whether coral would attach to rubber at all, and whether cheap, untreated steel clips could hold up against 50 years of open ocean. The ocean doesn't care how good your intentions were going in. Materials behave according to their own chemistry and physics, not according to what people hope will happen to them. And the only way to know how something holds up underwater is to actually test it before committing 2 million tires to the bet. A decision that took one afternoon to make can take a century and tens of millions of dollars to undo. What looked like a bright idea 50 years ago is still sitting on the ocean floor today. 2 million tires that were supposed to become a reef instead became an environmental disaster that took decades just to start undoing. Subscribe for more.